Dystopian fiction has been moved to current affairs.
Hello, and welcome to episode 14 of Dystopian Fiction Has Been Moved to Current Affairs. I'm Claire, and I'm here with my co host, Marsha. And this week, we're going to be talking about The Way, recent three-part drama made by Michael Sheen, James Graham, and Adam Curtis on the BBC. First thing to note is that those of you who are anxiously waiting for this episode to drop last weekend, we're very sorry. I had no voice. It's not good for podcasting. So we decided to delay and record this week. And here I am with my beautiful dulcet tones back working again. But we did use the time to do a little bit of a review of what we've got coming up. So we'll post a revised schedule for upcoming episodes onto the website and on Instagram, so you can check out the next things that we'll be doing there. And I hope that this episode was worth the wait. So, Marsha, do you want to tell us all about The Way and the many, many things that happen in this show?
Yeah, it's a very packed show. It's only 3 episodes long. I think they're each about 50 minutes, but it's got a lot to talk about, which we'll get into. Sort of an overall synopsis is the show starts off with this tale of a steelworker and his son, where the son dies in a tragic industrial accident, and the father of this sort of victim self immolates of himself. Mm-hmm. Is that correct to say?
Yeah.
Which, very striking. And then the sort of story begins, and that's funnily enough, is the spark of where the story unravels to tell how the steel workers in this Welsh town on the coast begin a strike for better sort of working environments, and the main focus is on the story of this family, the Driscoll family. It's the story of them and their relation to this strike, and Jeff's sort of, what's the word, family trauma.
Yeah, the fact that he had this father who had been a great activist during the mine strike and had subsequently ended his life by suicide. So
yes, generational trauma, sort of based off that story. And over the episodes, they basically decide to leave Wales as England becomes this sort of increasingly controlling fascist power over, the Welsh, closing the borders, and it's them sort of leaving this town that has their family has been at for over generations, and all this sort of different emotional and physical sort of push and pull that they experience over their travels.
Yeah, that's well put. I mean, it was interesting. I will put a link in the show notes, but there was an interview done with the creators and some of the cast by the BFI, and Michael Sheen was saying that when they first kind of came up with this idea, which is quite a long time back, pre-COVID, they were thinking about essentially creating the familiar refugee story, but in reverse. That was what they originally were focused on. And obviously it's retained a certain degree of that, but I think its flavour has changed from kind of their original idea, from where they decided, I think, to focus in on this single family and also to set it in Port Talbot. And it's also very apt, as it's turned out, although I don't think they could have planned for this, that it comes at a time when the main steelworks in Port Talbot, Tata Steel, have made the decision to close blast furnaces to replace them begin replacing them at the end of this year, which is going to lead to significant redundancies. And so there have indeed been the sort of protests, not to the same degree, of course, happening. So there is a sort of a real life backdrop to this. And it has a personal link there for Michael Sheen to his own upbringing and his home in Port Talbot as well. So that, I think, that kind of like very sort of that identifying with the sort of Welsh background and the kind of working class family and those kinds of things that we see feel like a very personal project. We should probably say, of course, that this show was panned. It had some of the worst reviews I have read of BBC show. And it is kind of weird. The viewer numbers were very low. a lot of people didn't keep watching after the first episode, which I thought was a shame, because the weirdness of it, the choppiness, the kind of like genre mashing, the kind of weird 80s horror film soundtrack, all of that was intentional, and maybe it hasn't succeeded, but I think if you buy into that, then there's something quite appealing about it. I don't know, what did you think?
I thought definitely the first episode is the strongest of the three. I guess, you know, is also something to say that if the strongest episode didn't really pull people on board, I don't know. I think you have to very much lean in to this. It's a very like off kilter mesh of different genres and stuff. But I think overall, despite sort of pushing a lot of things into this 3-episode run, I think, you know, it's a very interesting exploration of, again, the original sort of idea of having this classic refugee story in reverse, which I think there was a lot of imagery towards the end that was very reminiscent of tune into our previous episode of Years and Years. If you watched Years and Years and you quite liked it, I'd say this is also something that you know, you should sort of give a go at.
Yeah, I think so. And you know, it's not as successful as Years and Years in many ways, but
no.
It's working in a different sort of genre world, which makes some of the difference. It's still got the sort of family drama, it's still got some of the sort of similar storylines. It's not got the sort of futuristic elements to it.
No.
It sort of takes some of our current issues and maybe kind of pushes them a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's a story of probably about 30 days long within the series, and it has a little sort of title card saying, you know, the number of days after the initial incident that sort of started the strikes.
Yeah, and it has that feeling, doesn't it, of sort of density to it, where, as you said, there's like this spark moment at the start, and it's the speed of kind of at which things change out kind of in an out of control way that I think is really interesting about it. It reminded me a little bit, I wrote a few weeks ago about the novel Prophet Song by Paul Lynch, which is set in dystopian alternative Ireland, where it's a bigger idea. It's like about kind of disintegration of a state following the institution of emergency powers by this fascistic government. But again, it's got that sort of like, you're a totally normal family, and then things start to kind of go completely crazy around you because of decisions that have been made or whatever, and then you're suddenly being forced to flee from your home. You know, that sort of turning around in a very short space of time was similarly done. So there's some interesting things there, and I do think, you know, the strength of this and Years and Years and Prophet Song is all this idea of kind of focusing in on a family and saying that, there are these big themes that affect a whole nation, and all these ideas about kind of like Welsh identity within the United Kingdom and where power lies and those sorts of things, and kind of the worker versus the corporation. But it's also about the idea of an estranged father who's haunted by his own dead father, and the mental health issues being experienced by the son Owen and his consequent or concurrent drug addiction. And at the same time, there's, you know, the daughter Thea, her husband is working abroad, so there's sort of that strain on the family. All of these are things that are going on and then have to be kind of overcome or sort of put in the background as they face the decision to leave, essentially. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and you can, I mean, some of the imagery and the influences are pretty heavy-handed. I think that, you know, we could talk about the bits of V for Vendetta and the I'm Spartacus elements and things at the end. But there is also something, I think, that feels unique about it.
Yes.
Maybe not in a totally good way, but it's definitely unique. So, I mean, what did you think about the very opening, when we sort of see things through Owen doing that like voiceover narration and so on? Like, how convinced were you by kind of Owen's character and his sort of arc?
Yeah, I feel like he's quite a complex sort of character, and I think out of probably, I don't know, I personally think that the sort of family as a whole, they're quite well written, except from maybe Dee. I didn't feel like I got as much from, but Owen, yeah, so he's for the listeners who haven't seen, younger child Jeff and Dee, and sort of struggles a lot with his mental health, and it sort of pushed him into a bit of a pitfall with I think he was dealing drugs and was also addicted to the same drugs that he was dealing, and it was part of a sort of culmination of what could be considered to have broken up the family, because Dee and Jeff are getting a divorce. But yeah, he kind of, in the opening monologue, it sort of sounds like he's almost stuck in a bit of a limbo, or how he just describes his life as like he wants something to change, or that he wants something to happen in this small town, Port Talbot. You know, this monologue is sort of portrayed over a number of scenes, and sort of pans over, again, the steelworker who self-immolates. And that's, I sort of kicks off the story in a very, interesting way. I mean, like, the practice of like self-immolation it's a form of protest, and it's actually like thousands of years old. I was doing a bit of research about it, but yeah, it's like it's interesting. It's considered an act of non-violence, but a sort of an act of non-violent protest, and can be both political, or alternatively, different reasons, even as like a religious practice. But this sort of initial scene sparks off a huge strike and a bit of a movement that does become very violent. And then as the story goes on, it's revealed that Owen's been framed as the beginner of this sort of, the first violent act, the first sort of bottle or brick thrown in this movement, which is, I think, quite interesting.
Yeah, so there's definitely this idea of kind of him going from having no sense of purpose to something that is providing him with meaning. That's definitely one of the sort of arcs of it. We don't get a very strong sense of the exact circumstances that have led to his sort of feelings of depression, but he associates the drugs that he is dealing and is addicted to are the prescription drugs that he has also been given by the doctor, I think, is the impression that we're given. So he's sort of like self-medicating on top of what he's been prescribed. It was a little bit of a reminder, I thought, of sort of the weaknesses of this overstrained mental health system, where essentially he sort of, he seems to have a sort of a sympathetic and attentive GP, but the underlying issues that are causing his state of mind and the sort of, the rage and the emptiness and so on that he's feeling, there's nothing's dealing with that. And as you said about generational trauma, we're sort of led to believe that because Owen's father, Jeff, had walked out over the drug issue, and also we learn had a very significant change in personality following his own father, Denny's suicide. This has fed down. And I think that, the fact that Jeff feels so, he's both kind of literally haunted by his memory of his father, Michael Sheen, turning up as the dead father, and also, I mean, we're not supposed to think it's a ghost, but it's like the memory of him, isn't it, in his own head. And he's sort of taken a different approach to like bringing up his son. Like he's been tried to be a more distant father, not have that kind of like influence. And of course, as a consequence, Owen has felt sort of abandoned by his father.
Yeah, I think the show really well illustrates how, like, generational trauma can sort of develop as sort of one person stuff. Jeff is shown to suffer the same feeling that his father abandoned him in one way, and to sort of mitigate that, as to not happen to his own son. He wants to protect his own son from that own feeling. He inadvertently, suffers the same issues, where Owen is still abandoned.
So sort of it's like the absent father theme, like a present and yet absent father. And it's played out a little bit further with the fact that there's Jeff also has a grandson, Reese, the 4-year-old son of his daughter Thea. And again, there's a sort of, he turns up for the birthday party and brings this pretty cool kind of marble rally present, but it says that it's for like 8+ or 7+ or something. So there's a sort of feel like you don't know anything about your grandson, you don't even know how old he is, and it's quite heartbreaking, really. So this idea of like this little boy whose father, works abroad and whose grandfather seems to be kind of like disengaged from the rest of the family, not necessarily through his own fault, but all of that is definitely there in the opening scenes. And we should probably say at this point that there's one prominent character in this family group who is not in fact family, who first turns up in this initial part. And I really liked Anna as a character. Again, some of the reviews were just like, oh, she's just there to provide the sort of perspective of the sort of Eastern European outsider, and to reflect on how Wales can be like, a struggling post-Soviet country or whatever it is. I think she's supposed to be Polish, isn't she? But what did you think of her character? Because I found her really quite sympathetic mostly.
Yeah, no, I think I agree. I think she also plays an important role as well, sort of putting in the sort of Eastern European perspective. I think, well, I mean, she also compounded with that. I think the one scene that I specifically remember of her very well is they're in this pub at this point where England's cracking down on the Welsh border. Welsh people are sort of being sort of hunted down, and they're all sort of sat there being like, oh, none of us can put on an English accent to buy a pint in this pub. And she's like, oh, I'm not actually Welsh, I can go do it. And it is again that sort of, it's the opposite. It's the sort of classic, it usually be sort of, you have an idea of who would be the person running from their home country. On the other hand, it's now sort of people from the UK who are the ones who are refugees in this situation.
Absolutely. And I think that there's definitely, and I think especially if we think about perhaps when this was first conceptualized, the focus has been a little bit different lately, but there's sort of idea of sort of the Polish people coming over and taking our jobs, and so and she's able to sort of play the opposite of that. She's actually a student, and she also contributes quite substantially within the sort of narrative.
Yeah, she's a nurse, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think, was there a line, I might be thinking of something that I'd watched differently, but I think there was a line where it was Owen saying to her, oh, what would you think, all these Welsh people coming along taking your jobs, and she says, I think fair play. And like,
yeah, exactly.
I think she was very well written. I think she served a good purpose, and like her character, I think there was a danger where she could fall into a bit of a sort of like female love interest for Owen, and she did sort of feed into that a bit, but also I think she served a very good role in sort of illustrating a sort of a concept, the concept that they wanted to explore.
Yeah, and I think that there was something there about sort of from this point at which they were just like, Tinder one night stands through to being like kind of forced into this situation where we didn't get a sort of like, this is love, it's forever and things like that. But it was something about the way in which they kind of changed one another and sort of made a connection that, she said something like, she doesn't do repeat bookings or something like that. I can't remember, over like her dating life at the beginning. And Owen obviously has these great problems with forming any kind of connection. And ultimately we see some connection formed there as two people of a similar generation. I thought that was quite effective. I also wondered about how you felt it was as a sort of depiction of Gen Z, because I think that one of the things that, yes, it is okay, it's kind of localized to this idea of declining industrial towns where the work that the generation before did is no longer there. So there's a real issue of sort of both over identity and actually over employment for people of that age and generation. But I wondered whether it wasn't also acting as something of a sort of microcosm on a wider feeling of sort of loss of identity, or like feeling disenfranchised from both like the future and the generations above. I don't know whether you felt that was something they were trying to achieve as well.
I mean, it wasn't something I'd particularly like in terms of in a Gen Z sort of lens. I didn't really see it that way. I think the overarching theme of feeling a bit disenfranchised from, in Owen's case, sort of like his family's legacy in the steelwork industry. Yeah, I mean, obviously very much at the moment there's like all these sort of stories and news reports about how Gen Z, I think I most recently read something about how when sort of reviewing the most happiest countries in the world, when asking people under the age of 30, England dropped from like, the UK dropped from 20th to 30th place because, especially with the sort of, situation with the housing, and sort of workers' rights and all these things, the sort of cost of living crisis, there's that feeling of Gen Z is always going to be stuck in this loop of sort of landlords and never really being able to get sort of the financial stability and sort of happiness that, the sort of generations before them promoted. I don't know, I think I read this interesting quote of sort of get rich or die trying mindset, which is being promoted to people. I don't know. Yeah, I fun enough, it was interesting to see because obviously Owen and Anna, I think Thea she's probably more millennial age.
I don't know what the age gap is supposed to be,
Yeah.
but Owen feels that kind of age where he probably should have been going to university or get like, I don't know what, like 20, early 20s maybe.
Yeah, probably.
And it must be like more like late 20s.
Yeah,
I guess.
but I definitely didn't feel with his character, which was quite refreshing to see the sort of stereotypical Gen Z-ification of a character that age for a show that's come out in this time. I think he didn't feel like a sort of caricature of what like writers of like at the moment sort of would think young people would be, and I think he seems quite realistic and relatable.
I'm just looking up how old Callum Scott Howells is. He is 24.
24.
So,
okay.
So yeah, probably about right. And one of the things that it made me think of is whether there's an element here of something that I'm more aware of with people who are not necessarily going to go down an academic pathway. So thinking about sort of, you and I, university educated and so on, gives you a sense, we were talking earlier about the idea of like how your degree might lead into career. I've done lots of degrees which have variously fed into my careers. It's sort of a pathway. There's a kind of like a roadmap for you. And yes, it might not be easy, but it's kind of set out for you. And you can achieve it. And then there's kind of the people who maybe feel, I've had students in the past who felt under pressure to go to university, even though they didn't think it was for them, or those who were struggling before that with the idea of kind of like not wanting to go to college, not wanting to apply for jobs when they were 18 and so on. And I'm not saying that, I don't want to stereotype it, but I think that there's a certain gap there that is likely to be increased with either the sort of loss of, I suppose, practical jobs and sort of apprenticeship pathways that used to go with those, things like industry. And we've talked before about kind of like the rise of AI and things like that, but just more generally kind of like technological advancement and having not necessarily unskilled jobs, I'm not suggesting that, but sort of jobs that lead into a technical skill. And I noticed that was one of the things that was picked up with the giving of that present to Reese, where Jeff was like, I wanted him to have something he could do with his hands. And I wonder whether that's something that the system in this country overlooks still, in spite of the rise in kind of apprenticeships and, the sort of work with BTECs and MVQs and things like that. I'm still not sure we're quite there. There's sort of a bit of a like, there's this pathway or there's these kind of other bits and pieces. We're not quite sure how it all fits together. So definitely something interesting going on there. And we also should sort of talk about this process that you were saying, from kind of this act of self-immolation by this desperate man protesting at his son's death, which in itself obviously is kind of like horrific and heartbreaking. But it is, as you say, this spark. And I think it's also quite interesting hearing the discussion behind it, because there's a question about the protest element, whether it's a sort of act of martyrdom, of defiance, of peaceful protest, or whether it's actually a sign of, breakdown, deep kind of psychological collapse through grief, and the idea that not only did the corporation not support we're not really told whether there's, really was a sort of health and safety problem, but presumably there must have been if somebody died in this situation. But also that there was no sufficient follow-up of corporate responsibility and support for the other worker, the father, who was left behind. So it triggered a number of things, kind of an ideological thing, and also a sort of like a particular discussion over the relationship between the workers and the corporation, which begins with Jeff as the floor manager. Is that his job title? And the union rep. I'm going to just get their name because I can't. So he's a trade union steward, according to Wikipedia. I'm not quite sure of all the technical terms. And I think that the other man is the rep, and they are appearing before the CEO or whatever it would be, the corporate leader of the steelworks, who is Chinese, I think, a Chinese company. So picking up on that idea of kind of international companies buying up British industrial plants, or whatever the term would be, steelworks here, and the sort of the way in which there's been this shifting, I suppose, away from the making of British products, British steel, and this idea that I think this external company was intended to rejuvenate, to keep alive a struggling industry, to make it profitable, and instead seems to be turning against them. And I just wondered, how can I put this? On the one hand, you were left feeling that this corporation had obviously failed people and weren't necessarily keeping their promises. Then you had Jeff, who we learn was basically trying to sort of mediate between the union and the company. And then we had the workers and the union members, who were eventually going to lead to strike and protest. And I just wondered, whose side were we supposed to be on, did you think?
So we're saying the divisions are Jeff, the union
I mean,
workers.
I don't think anyone's supposed to be particularly on the side of the corporation, although they're not outright. We're not led to believe that they're outright villainous.
No. I mean,
and then there's Jeff in the middle, and then there's the kind of union rep and D and so on.
I think we're very much meant to sympathize with Jeff's position, especially compounded with his throughout the series, sort of Jeff's, heritage from his father Denny, having sort of led the steel workers in a sort of strike back in 1984, I think it was, the miners' strikes and stuff. I think it was compounded.
That's right.
And he's very much always compared to his father, but in his eyes, he sort of sees that his father failed, and at the end of the day, because of his failure, killed himself. So it's kind of, again, this push and pull of, he obviously wants a better sort of living environment for his co-workers, better working environment even, for his co-workers, but also is doing something different to the way that his father did it, because he doesn't see it as an actual effective solution to the issue. So I think overall meant to sort of sympathize with Jeff. I think is very much written from his perspective, and we're given a lot of insight into how he feels, especially with the sort of the choice of having Michael Sheen as being his sort of father's ghost, I think which was interesting. Also, maybe you should talk a little bit about what you thought about the weird church bell imagery that Owen kept seeing throughout the series. That was an interesting.
So it's like the church bell ringing in a drowned city. And it feeds into this. Obviously, there's kind of a lot of folktale and mythological sort of imagery, appropriate to kind of Wales, where we, I think, associate a lot of this stuff, but also doing quite a lot of heavy lifting, I thought, at times, doing quite a lot of different things, at any rate, this imagery. But you're right, with Owen, I think it was interesting because it's, on the one hand, a sort of slightly cliched way of, feeling sort of swamped by the state of the world and by his mental health and feeling like he's drowning, and those kinds of things. But at the other hand, it was doing something more than that, because it was supposed to be kind of connecting with a kind of Wales of the past, a Wales that perhaps is not there anymore. It's drowned. It's still sounding out its presence, but he's going to kind of come out of it. And then there's various imagery in the same scenes that have to do with his father and grandfather, and like, whether they're part of the kind of process of pulling him down or pulling him out of this drowning situation. It's all very, very arty and so on, and I say a little bit much, I thought, but if we want to analyze it, I think that those are the things it's trying to do. So he's got his drowning, and Jeff has got his conversations with his ghost of his father, and we've got quite a lot of stuff that I think is to do with what you were saying, this kind of push and pull between past, present, and future, ways of doing things, ways that have been done in the past. And there are lots of ways in which it feels current, with kind of the increasing limitation on things to do with right to protest in this country and concerns around that. We'll come on to the sort of very heavy-handed response to that idea of protest. The place of unions, perhaps. I mean, we're at a time when we're actually seeing quite a lot of union action in this this country, again, in a way that perhaps we haven't seen for some time. Particularly, we've seen the junior doctors' strikes have just been extended. What is the place of unions now? What is their power? Do unions need to change in order to to get anywhere in the face of corporations and so on? And we've also seen an increase in unionization, for example, the movement of unionization in Starbucks, for example, and also the attempts to crush unions in Amazon and so on. So it's an interesting time from that perspective. But it was also interesting that I thought it's, as you say, Jeff's position is an interesting one. He's kind of trying to tread this middle ground where he tries to keep open the avenues of conversation, but he is ultimately seen as a traitor, betraying the kind of union meeting minutes to the corporate powers. But he's also saying, this idea of us all kind of coming together in protest, like, none of us is part of the same community anymore. Sort of saying, he's the only one who's there in their like workers' club or whatever it is where they meet. He's like, I'm there night after night. None of you are there. If we couldn't be successful when we were part of this united kind of sense of identity in the past, in the 80s, when we didn't succeed in the miners' strikes, how are we going to succeed now? And I thought that was a really interesting reflection on kind of this idea about sort of isolationism, individualism, and that sense of not coming, dividing the workers in order to be able to kind of maintain some sort of power over them. It might also be worth us just mentioning briefly about what's happening at Tata Steel, because this, I think, is, although Tata Steel in Port Talbot is not exactly the steelworks that is depicted, it obviously is the same place in the sort of the two landscapes, and they have announced these significant redundancies at the end of this year, up to 2,500 jobs. And the decision is being made because it's about the slightly differently from the show, where we're told that they're sort of redoing one of the blast furnaces. The idea is that there's a need to transition from blast furnace, which is incredibly impactful in terms of carbon emissions in this country. In fact, I think it is the biggest carbon producer. Did I read that? Because of the nature of we're going into science now, Marsha. This is going to go all wrong. But there was a thing about how they work, and the fact that, okay, right, so for every ton of steel produced in a blast furnace, 2,000 kilos of CO2 are emitted. For every ton of steel made in an electric furnace, which they're going to move over to, 150 to 200 kilos of CO2 emitted, according to Tata Steel. So it's a huge reduction. It's the equivalent of the annual emissions of almost 2 million homes. And it will be like a 15 to 20% cut in Wales's overall emissions, is the theory. But there's also a bit of a problem because it's going to take 4 to 5 years to build. It's causing all of these redundancies without having a strategy for the kind of green economy and the employment of these people within it. And in the meantime, we'll have to import steel to the UK, which of course involves increasing carbon emissions. So it's not as straightforward as it seems. And so I've read some very, very interesting things about stuff that I knew nothing about to do with this. But there's a sense of, like, we need to have greener steel making, we need to meet these targets, but because we don't have a strong kind of arc for moving to a green economy and thinking about the way in which employment matters, we don't have a positive vision basically for a green future in this country, and we don't have an effective long-term strategy and the incentives that kind of go with it. You're actually causing untold problems as part of your plan to do this. And I think that although that environmental message wasn't explicit in the show, I think it's a really interesting one, this idea that we are in changing times, and we need to make sure that we have got a bigger plan than just, oh, let's do this one thing here and do it like this. It needs to have an overall structure. And that's interesting when you look at kind of the general election that we may or may not be having later this year in October, and what there have been quite big questions over sort of Labour's change of the figure that they put on their environmental strategy and then took off their environmental strategy. And are we seeing that kind of overall planning? I think is going to be a really interesting question. But yeah, I mean, let's talk about the protest, because it was pretty good. I thought it what did you think about? Again, there's a bit of an arc to the protest, from the kind of like beginning of the strike action via Red Monk appearance. I'm doing hand actions again for the listeners at home. So via the Red Monk through to the idea of kind of the actual reaction to the police, which we'll get onto in a moment. But what did you think it was to say about protest?
I mean, I think there was the sort of the picket lines that were going on, which started off pretty peaceful, and I think there was this sort of, the turning point was, why did they start? Remind me why they started marching. I think there was sort of
began, I think, with the decision to import external workforce.
Yes.
To continue production.
Yeah.
Again, buying into sort of this narrative of, well, if you don't like it, somebody else will do it.
Yeah. Which is also, again, this sort of, it also relates to sort of the ideas of like when international workers are sort of brought in, often enough they do the work that most people don't want to do. I don't know. It's all I don't know, very interesting sort of crossovers. But I guess the sort of breaking point was we can sort of bring in another sort of dystopian aspect of Owen gets framed for throwing herself first. A pipe, I think, but it's sort of deep faked to look like a Molotov cocktail or something like that, which causes the shop to be set on fire, and that's when the sort of this violence break out. And so at the sort of peak of the first episode, where this sort of happens, and I believe there's a bit of a cut, and so that suddenly the center of Port Talbot is all sort of on fire. There's people screaming, running around. It's suddenly all out of control, which I think was
and very... Jeff, who's been sitting up with his sort of broken placard or whatever, thinking, what's going on, gets the call that he needs to come down and help.
Oh yeah. Throughout the series, Jeff is very attached to this sword. The sword goes everywhere. What is the sword for? It's probably weighing you down. You don't know how to use it.
No. I mean, again, the sword is carrying a symbolic weight, right? It's the one of the original pieces of steel manufactured on the site. And it ties in with this idea that the ghost of one of the original monks of the Abbey site in their red habits still kind of watches over the place, and that the last bit of Abbey wall must remain standing or Port Talbot will fall, and the pilot light of the blast furnace must never go out, because that is the end of everything. So it's doing, there's so much of this sort of imagery. But yeah, I think that the sword is again, it encapsulates something of the past, something of the sort of interesting sort of mythologizing of the town and its industry and the steelworks perhaps as well, that makes it more than just an industrial plant. Sometimes I think this idea that we're more interested in the sort of nostalgia around a story, and the power that has. I was listening to an interesting podcast this morning that touches a little bit on some of the themes of this, but it was particularly talking about the rise of Thatcherism again.
Yes.
And this idea that 30 years on from Margaret Thatcher, people are talking, about another Thatcher, finding another Thatcher, being a modern Thatcherite and things like that among the Tory party, and indeed among the Labour Party. Has been these questions about admiration for Margaret Thatcher and what that means, and whether it's just about her efficiency as a political leader, or whether it's actually sort of saying, everybody's turning into her economic model and those sorts of things, which I think is true. But what was interesting about it is the fact that people have been citing these stories and kind of things about Margaret Thatcher, including like anecdotes that are in fact from the satirical depictions of her, so like turning into stories about the real person, things that were made up as part of a satirical mockery of her. And these have blended into this kind of mythology of Thatcher that doesn't actually have anything to do. It certainly doesn't look at the way in which Thatcher left power, the sort of ultimate end of her form of conservatism, these kinds of things. And, not sort of trying to say that this is about Thatcher per se, but I'm sort of saying that it's about, see, with the sort of miners' strikes depiction and the way in which that documentary footage is kind of used, we've got something that harks back to that time, so it's sort of the opposite side of myth, and again kind of like makes it into something other than it was, in the same way that people are kind of making Thatcher into a story rather than something real. And I wonder whether there's a little bit of kind of drawing on this idea that the story of what the miners stood for more than the actual effect of what they did. And so things like the story of the sword and the story of the red monk and the story of how when a van backs into the wall and it falls down, that this is terribly significant, and the ominous moment where Owen and Anna are making out on the seawall and then the pilot light goes out. It's all kind of really hyped. But yeah, and I'm taking it as meant to be funny when Jeff goes rushing in with his sword, and then immediately somebody's like bang straight into him and he falls down. It's kind of like that failure of the intervention. But you lead us nicely onto one of the key bits about the kind of policing of this, because it's not the protest per se, it's the, I think, reaction to the protest. One of the things that I think is interesting about the protesting generally is that I think is sort of negative in the way it's viewed, is it sort of becomes a protest against everything.
Yes.
We don't actually hear what the strike is demanding. It seems to be, there seems to be some disagreement over exactly what it is. I mean, we do hear some of it, but it doesn't seem to be overall consensual. It becomes much more a kind of like what, like Dee in her inspiring speeches is, saying, don't pay your fuel bills. One of the sort of protest suggestions, don't pay because their corporate leaders claim these massive bonuses and it's coming out of your pocket, things like that. And then we see like this footage of other sites, steelworks and other industrial sites going, yeah, we like what they're doing there, we're going to do it too. Not for the same reasons, more as a sort of like solidarity strike of all workers everywhere against the kind of corporate higher powers. And that, I think, is what leads to this kind of overreaction, and the overreaction then leads to more violence. So it's like a chicken and egg situation.
Yeah.
But if we just hold the thought about the sort of deep faking in a minute, because I think that's really interesting. I just thought we should start with the fact that the deep faking is actually produced not by the police, but by this private company called Gordius. And they're drafted in to support the police, and they kind of have their own separate room doing their own secret work, and they seem to be taking the lead rather than the police kind of working with them. They're sort of directing what the police does. And so I just wondered what you thought about that. I found this really interesting, this kind of use of the theme of privatization of the police.
Yeah, so what are these sort of like old mercenaries or something? I'm not sure what what the implications, there probably needs to be a bit more research about the implications of bringing in a sort of privatized force, because do they have the same amount of sort of, you know, accountability as a public police force? Like, what happens when, you know, certain sort of incidents might happen, or, you know, otherwise non-incidents, you know, where a police force is sort of private, where does their sort of power begin and end? And what, I guess it sort of brings in those sorts of questions, which I feel like they didn't really explore as much what the powers of Gordius were, outside of the fact that they sort of have materialized as a bit of an agenda against the Driscoll family.
So I did do quite a lot of reading on it. I will put the paper that I most read about this, but I knew about the background in the bringing of the private sector into certain aspects of what we might kind of associate with the police and security. So back in sort of the 2008 to 2012 kind of time was when we first started seeing some of the discussions. So this was when a company called G4S was given contracts over prisons with some devastating consequences. We're talking about the period of austerity under the coalition government, and as part of that, where significant cuts were being made to public budgets and so on as part of the austerity agenda. One of the ways in which this was kind of dealt with was the bringing in of private companies, and G4S got some of these contracts. It wasn't the only way that it was done, and I'll put this paper in which discusses really interesting things about kind of like how communities and companies started paying for their own kind of police forces, like not paying for like private security, but paying for the national police to recruit more people. So like they were like, here you are, here, have this money that covers the cost of another policeman, and as long as we get this in return for it. So that was an interesting area. And then also the rise in use of private security instead of relying on the police. And I suppose that what we're seeing there is something very very real that happened as policing was being cut, people having to turn to other things, where it became problematic. For example, the rise in vigilantism. And I suppose the real question is like, where are we okay with in the police force, where there is incorporation of the private sector in some parts of it? Where are we okay with that? And I think that, you know, lots of people might feel that the sort of side of things where they are, I think there's a study that calls it like the steering jobs and the rowing jobs. And I hope I'm not going to get this completely wrong, but basically like the rowing jobs would be like, we're okay with somebody who's from a private company, like booking in people at a police station, or like doing sort of certain administrative work, or doing things that are like, I suppose, like governed by somebody else. And where we may be uncomfortable with it is where they're in a steering role, where they're basically saying, this is where we're going with our agenda, where this is where we're taking like our investigations and so that. And Gordius, I think, is put into that steering role. It's like taking control over what they can do. And we see kind of have this strange relationship where they seem to be, I know this is where it becomes kind of like unreal, but it's sort of outside the law, or given certain powers that the police don't have, because as we see, there doesn't seem to be any problem with them basically producing kind of deep fake videos. So for me, I mean, I have this, on the one hand, there's like, well, what's the difference? What's the difference between paid policemen, paid by the state, and private sector policing, where they're doing like, you know, basically kind of like doing the same jobs, maybe doing it more efficiently, running it outside of kind of the sort of restrictions of you know, the civil service and public sector jobs. But then what it comes down to is the fact that it's profit making. And that was one of the things it didn't say explicitly, but there was quite a lot about like we want a certain story, because then it looks like we're doing our job. So it makes no difference whether the Driscolls are guilty. We make that story, and then we arrest them, and then we have like
something to show
solution. Something exactly. And I was interested to read that there was, I didn't know about this, but there was one of the things that G4S were hauled up on is that in one police force that they were working as part of, they were when 999 calls were not coming in as much as they should have been, they were making fake 999 calls so that they could log them as like, tick, we answered this many 999 calls and we met our targets.
Crazy.
Yeah. So, you know, it's a small thing that fits into that bigger picture.
Yeah. I guess it therefore explains the motivation for the sort of framing of Owen and his family is exactly that, is to sort of, you know, have something to show for.
Yeah, that's what I thought. And it got picked up a bit later on by the what's it called? The Welsh finder.
The Welsh catcher.
The Welsh catcher, that's it. Yeah. You know, he seems to be like employed in some sort of private capacity, so about like the people who employ him and so on, and like they have their own agenda. It's all very like, you know, conspiracy theory stuff, but it all resonates a little bit with things that are genuine. And I think that, you know, this question about the privatization within the public sector is one that isn't going away. What did you think about this whole idea of kind of like the use of deep fakes and how relevant that is to us now?
Yeah, no, I mean, I feel like it's something that's been sort of discussed in the public sphere in the past couple of years, but it's not really cropped up as much as stuff like AI, I'd say. But I guess that's, I mean, part of the point is that deep fakes are meant to be, you know, deep and fake. You're not meant, no, I don't know, maybe they're everywhere and we haven't really noticed yet.
Yeah, I was interested in this because this question about whether they are everywhere, I think that we've got this, I suppose the big question is less in the kind of criminal justice sphere, so much in kind of politics and electioneering, although obviously it can be used in any kind of place. But I was interested to see that we've already got what I think I would refer to as deep fake photographs being used as part of Donald Trump's campaign. AI generating images of him with black people to encourage black voters. It's AI generated. You can tell from things like AI is not very good at hands and fingers and stuff like that at the moment. You can see from that sort of thing, and they're all a bit sort of shiny and perfect. But you know, it is being done, and that stuff is being propagated. And then audio deep fake is, I think, becoming more of a problem. The case of Sadiq Khan, I think. The idea of like what he allegedly said about the protests on Armistice Day, and he didn't. It was an audio deep fake. And so, you know, convincing video deep fakes, I think, are very close. And there's talking of AI, there's some new part of, I think, of ChatGPT that I may be wrong about that. I'll double check and put the link in the show notes. But certainly this idea that basically you can input an instruction and get a video, kind of 60-second videos just basically made by AI to depict the thing you want to depict, and that this is going to be, you know, freely available, and we are going to see this transition. So I thought that was quite interesting. I also thought that it was interesting the amount of data we were sort of told that they were kind of like getting into. Like lots of the footage is security camera, like that's how we see it. Did you like that, the way that they used that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's the most realistic way for them to be viewing. I mean, again, it's also that question of like privacy of where are they? Is this all public police security cameras set up? Probably not. It's probably, you know, private companies that set up the security footage, and then there was the family friend and the government or whatnot had just given them a USB stick of all of their private documents.
Yeah, like GCHQ have all this stuff, and again, you know, I tried to grasp what the law is on this and in this country, and you know, who knows what sort of the security services and so on have. But in terms of policing, it's all this kind of stuff about proportionality and stuff that meets the specific criteria of reducing offences and protecting the public and so on. But it certainly felt like these things often do, like that we're moving into a more and more kind of invasive culture. And I think we said that we're going to do the show The Capture in a couple of episodes' time, from 2019, which basically took this kind of idea and pushed it further, the idea of kind of using deep fake in security footage and taking that as a concept. Like, we're also keen to have cameras absolutely everywhere, but what is the price we pay for that? What do you feel about like being videoed on people's doorbells and things like that? Because that's not a thing.
God, I mean, it's hard. Obviously, it's tough to say. I guess with the doorbell thing, it's a bit difficult just because it's like, you know, you're on someone else's sort of, I guess, private property. I don't know how much that's. I don't know. I don't think the sort of being on someone's property thing is as big of a issue in the UK as it would be, for example, in the US. Because I guess we're sort of less in that sense territorial, and also thank God no firearms. But yeah, it's hard. It's hard to say.
Yeah, it is this idea, isn't it, about sort of balance and people's desire for kind of their personal security versus their personal liberty. And it comes back to this kind of philosophical ideas that we like policing is done by public consent. If we sort of say we will give up this extent of our liberty, we will allow this to happen so that we benefit from being better protected.
Yes.
But, you know, how far can you push that assumed consent of the public? So yeah, that's interesting. We learn much later on in episode 3 that this is all part of policing by algorithm. This idea that basically Owen has been kind of flagged up on the system as somebody who is likely to be
this weird
and so
equation thing,
that now so that we can preemptively arrest him. And that, I have to say, it's one of those dystopian concepts. It's minority report and all that, but it really terrifies me. This, like, it goes back to this sort of eugenicist idea around kind of like, oh, people who, you know, what do they say in the Victorian period, like people who's had faces this shape and ears like this and things like that, are more likely to commit crime.
Yeah, it's the sort of potential of something happening rather than the actual act of, which is where the sort of issue, you know, sort of comes in. But yeah, no, that's because the Welsh character, which is again, I think there's some really great things about the series, and then they sort of, I know it's all, some of it's meant to be symbolic with the red monk and the sword, but then they bring in stuff like the Welsh catcher, and I'm like, okay, you've lost me a little bit. This is, you know, but yeah, no, he sort of goes, he really goes on the sort of almost how it's like beyond human comprehension of what these equations can really say, and we almost like we just have to follow them. Like there's not even any like critical thinking behind what.
Certainly, that felt, you know, a little bit more kind of you know, I guess science fiction-y, slightly more than some of the things that they do. And I think other things, you know, they're deliberately playing on the extremes. So if we get like through, so in the second episode, it's largely about the sort of the journey and the kind of walking and where they're going to go, trying to get out of Port Talbot, and then learning that the crossing into England is closed. Now, of course, there are land borders into England, so you know it's hard to police all of it. But then we learn that kind of like the English in some of the places are becoming vigilantes against the Welsh. And again, some reviewers were really like, oh, this is like playing up Welsh nationalism, and there isn't any such kind of you know, divide between the English and the Welsh. But I suppose I read it more as a metaphor for like how easy it is to create othering of people who you don't like, you know, how easy it is to create them into something. Okay, it's a bit ridiculous, you know, perhaps the language of vermin and things like that, but isn't it trying to reflect the language that gets used around you know, people like Suella Braverman and Priti Patel and so on, who have used this very inflammatory language against refugees and asylum seekers, or illegal immigrants as they would characterize them. I don't know, what do you think about that sort of like Welsh English thing?
I mean, I think it's taken to an extreme because obviously there's a sort of, you know, Welsh English inspired long sort of history there. But yeah, no, I again, I think it's just a sort of another example to illustrate a real world sort of extreme patriotism in the UK, and sort of being like, oh, you know, keep them out, or, you know, sort of idea.
I guess I would be somewhat sympathetic towards this view that there is a certain sort of English nationalism inherent in the so-called British English governing system. So what I mean is like government at Westminster has a kind of English bias to it. And yes, we have got devolution to Scotland and Wales. Northern Ireland's a slightly different situation, but the powers that we see it with, like we have the Welsh minister, so the one who's a part of the Welsh government, and the Westminster MP for Port Talbot, and they're kind of like the limitations of the power of the first, and the fact that the second one runs away back to London and so on, plays on this. And again, they think, you know, these are things that I, as a not Welsh person, you know, want to sort of sympathise with the sort of limitations potentially that they may feel in terms of self-governance, in the face, not that I'm saying that Westminster is doing the sorts of things we see in the show, but perhaps the kind of like the potentiality for that is maybe something that is really felt. I don't know. We see this obviously with like Dee's sister, I think it's called Elaine, and her husband Hector. Used to have a rabbit called Hector. Very much this kind of posh English couple living in Cheltenham, I think, in the west of England. And they've got to be a parody, haven't they?
I'm sure.
What did you think of that whole beginning of episode 3?
Oh god, I was sat there in my student union. I was like, okay, the last episode, it was, I think it was the time that we were, going to record it the day after next week. I was like, oh, got some spare time, put it on. I'm like, I've definitely just dimmed my screen a lot. I was like, oh. Yeah, again, also a very weird addition to the show. I don't know what it was maybe sort of meant to serve as a,
just
I don't know,
so that we got that moment really sure, of the refugees all turning up by the
I genuinely don't know. I was very strange addition. Maybe it was, I'm not sure.
Like we're talking about the swinging scene, foursome scene. I don't know.
Yes, weird foursome scene. Maybe sort of trying to, as an ode of sexually progressive times in the UK. I'm not sure. Maybe, but yeah, it was a comical sort of when the like whole family was just stood at the window in sort of war, and Owen goes, just to let you know, no one saw anything, and I think Dee or Theo were like, oh, that's very convincing, wasn't it? It was good. It was good.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like these are obviously, Elaine, Dee's sister, is obviously like sort of denying her Welsh identity. She's sort of lost her accent, and she's not defending kind of the anti-Welsh sentiments that are being brought out by these kind of public schoolboy type, middle class sort of city type men, who we're sort of presented with Hector, the husband, and the next door neighbor. And so this idea that she's kind of like, I don't know, abandoned her roots or whatever, and is in denial. But in the end, actually, of course, what we see is this sort of idea that somewhere in this kind of, they're decent, blood runs thicker than water, they recognise. It reminded me of this sort of narrative where everybody's very good at being highly insensitive to things that they have no personal experience of, and then the moment it's actually a real person, a real group of people, especially somebody with a connection to you, but not even necessarily that, then it becomes like, that's when we become humane, and that's sort of what they do. And it's the similar narrative, something we haven't touched on, is Rhys, this 4-year-old boy who is staying with his grandparents, his father's parents, in Wales, and whose grandfather basically smuggles him out of Wales in the back of a truck, and leaving, and I felt this quite strongly, leaving his disabled wife behind, and not having any means to make sure that she is still okay, and that somebody is looking after her. And we talked before about kind of the presentation of this idea of kind of traveling in the back of a truck. The grandfather gives his watch as payment. I was quite touched actually by this idea of kind of like this grandfather looking after his grandson in that circumstance. But I suppose what happens, is we're led to think, oh, this is great. They're all reunited. They've met up with this woman from GCHQ who is also secretly Welsh, and therefore gives them like their documents illegally so that they can travel. And then there's the Freemason narrative as well. And I don't know what this was trying to like add. It turns out that Hector is about to become a Freemason. His next door neighbor is sponsoring him into the Masons. And then the grandfather, when he turns up, does the handshake. And lo and behold, he's got a network who is going to help him get back to Wales. It's
actually, I was sat there for a minute just being like, wait, let's just go back a second. I was like, I was completely like,
yeah, you kind of got to get what they're like. It's nudge nudge wink wink secret handshake.
It's so nudge 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 wink 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 wink. I was so confused. I was so confused.
And
no,
haven't seen a good kind of like bit of Freemasons conspiracy in this kind of drama for a little while. It wasn't necessarily that negative. I mean, I'm pretty anti the Freemasons, but this idea of kind of, I suppose, community connection, networking, and how reliant one becomes upon that in dire situations is presumably what's being alluded to. Something that is bigger than nationhood, like the sort of Masonic link overrides the Welsh English divide. I don't know what that was trying to do.
Yeah, it was very, yeah. Again, it was doing a lot. It was doing a lot throughout this whole series, to be fair.
Yeah, another one of those kind of myth stories, sort of like secret society things. I mean, obviously it's real, but it's still a secret society. Something going on there. But anyway, they get, fortunately, Hector has a canal boat, handy stuff. Off they go down to Dover, and then we're left with this other very complex thing, which is that Thea's husband's got permanent residency in Germany, so she should be able to get into Germany with Rhys as a refugee, but she's not sure about the rest of the family. Owen has a criminal record because she once saved him from angry drug dealers by arresting him and getting him out of their way. And Thea, it turns out, is not the biological daughter of Jeff. So then, and of course, Jeff and Dee were supposed to be getting divorced. So then it's like, how will all of these kind of interplaying things reduce the likelihood of them being able to claim asylum? And that's why they decide that they're going to take the illegal route, because they think they might be stopped at the border otherwise. We've talked about this, I think, being done very well in Years and Years, and the reason that they're forced to make the crossing by small boat then. How convincing did you find this sort of set of dramatizing of why a family might make an illegal crossing?
I mean, it's hard to say from my middle class, British perspective. Obviously, I haven't,
I should also say, it's not illegal to cross the channel in that way, and I should stop saying illegal crossing because I was just buying into Tory rhetoric. So let's say
you out
not using official migration routes.
Yes. I mean, again, as I sort of said at the beginning of the episode, I feel like it was very reminiscent of the sort of a section of Years and Years. But I think they were trying to cross the channel the other way, which is, classically what happens whilst, I think from here is England to mainland Europe. And we sort of, again, it was the sort of theme of like, someone had to sacrifice themselves, or the boat was too heavy and sort of water was leaking in, and Jeff took, the sort of initiative to throw himself off the boat for the sort of better good. Yeah, I went whilst watching it, even the series was very short, found it quite heartbreaking. Again, very sort of like intense and sort of
the fear and so on. Was
it definitely communicated. Which I thought was very effective, and again, I shed a tear or two.
I think it is very powerful for us kind of like seeing. I put the link, listening to David Miliband talk about his work with refugees and the Rwanda bill. He was being asked about the Rwanda bill, and he was basically making this point that among the many, many things that's wrong with the Rwanda bill, there's a specific point, which is that it's supposed to be a deterrent. And he was like, these people are already risking their lives. They know that there is, a high level of risk to this form of channel crossing. How do you think that being potentially sent to Rwanda is more of a disincentive than possibly dying? So that it just doesn't make any fundamental sense. And I felt it was a good reminder of kind of the the high level of risk that's involved. And also I think, yes, okay, maybe we're not fully convinced by the sort of narrative of persecution and desperation, because maybe we're hanging on to this idea that, somehow this could be sorted out in some other way. But actually, I think you could see quite quickly how, like, all the official parts have been closed down to them. Like, who do you turn to in that situation when it seems to be your own government who is acting against you and falsifying information against you, persecuting you in that way? So that does mirror a narrative of why people flee their country and seek asylum. And I suppose also what we saw was this idea that we were seeing the parallel of the fact that we haven't got the proper access points for seeking asylum in this country being mirrored by the idea that they didn't have any kind of like system by which they could kind of officially try and claim asylum. They had to just rock up on the shore and hope for the best. So that was sort of mirroring something in reverse, something very real. It also tied into, I was just thinking about when you were talking about like Jeff and his decision. Do you think that it was supposed to kind of mirror his journey of understanding his father and then of course meeting the same end, different means, but basically
I mean, I think that's again what I was sort of saying is I think Jeff especially has the most sort of like development throughout the sort of story and understanding what his, I feel like he has a great he feels a bit lost in what his role is as a father and almost as a, you know, a representative for the union, and it's sort of that realization of where he can step in. Sort of, I think it'd be wrong to say that he necessarily came to the same end as his father, because I think it was more of a self-sacrifice in a sort of, you know, hoping for, again, giving his family a better future rather than the sort of abandonment I feel like he experienced with his father's suicide. I think it was quite well done in that sense. I think he was probably, in a weird way, I thought he was most likable out of the whole cast.
I mean, you know, I think that in the face of being seen as kind of like pathetic and failing, we actually saw all the kind of good intentions and the struggles and so on. And I mean, we're led to believe obviously that his sacrifice was the thing that meant that they stayed afloat and got safely to the other side. There was a bit of a narrative of him constantly wanting to kind of step up and be the patriarch,
step up,
and like never quite being able to do it.
That's true.
But obviously he kind of does it in that final act, but it's a stepping like away rather than a stepping up in a way, which it was quite powerful. And of course his body washes up and Owen finds it, so there's that moment of kind of like reconciling Owen's relationship with his father through his father's death. We find that before they get into this boat that there is a camp, a refugee camp set up in the sands on the coast near Dover. And these are kind of like the Welsh refugees and that sort of thing. And there's some interesting reflections there on sort of this narrative of identity and so on, because of the sort of different groups of Welsh people and how they feel in the face of the Driscolls bringing risk to them and that sort of thing. But ultimately we get the whole Red Monk scene. So I think this just brings us nicely back to this kind of idea of the power of story. Okay, so the Red Monk is basically the V for Vendetta mask, but it's like monk's habit instead. We know that people have been like wearing them, but we also learn that the very first sighting of a Red Monk was in fact Jeff. He wasn't in fact like apathetic and so on. He was trying to provide a point of unity or something,
or a symbol,
a symbol that seems to have been effective, although I still think we're not quite sure what it's a symbol of. But he's the symbol and then they pick up on the symbol. It was terribly cliched, wasn't it? But I quite liked the sort of I'm Spartacus moment of them all standing in their red habits and every hood being black. What did you think that the Red Monk thing stood for?
Well, obviously it was kind of a symbol of I mean it was a symbol of sort of the protests and the strikes and sort of an overall like maybe kind of I think towards the end it became sort of this like, it sort of showed how the other people in the refugee camp can also empathize with the sort of, you know, Driscoll's experience, and you know they sort of stand together in a like sort of form of connection of like, you know, they're all experiencing this sort of reality where, you know, they're having to evacuate. it's hard. I feel like it sort of changes as it goes along.
Yeah, I wonder whether there's something there about this idea that, so it starts off as this kind of story, hails back to something in the past, but I wonder whether it becomes something that effectively is forward looking. It stops being kind of the signified story, and it becomes a signifier of something else, like that it's standing up to kind of persecution and the treatment of the Driscolls and the treatment of kind of people more widely and kind of authorities overall, and sort of looking forward to a kind of change, because I think there's sort of like a stories and myths are powerful, but they're also kind of like ghosts of your past, and you're stuck like, trying to sort of make the present fit with something that doesn't exist anymore. And there's that weird mention of the fact, like the internet, like they turned it off and on again in Wales, and then when they turned it on again, it was all like people like Morris dancing and markets from the 1950s and like community policemen in top hats and things like that. You know, it was like looking back to some artificial kind of idea of the past. And like everyone was supposedly Googling, like, I want everything to go back to how it used to be, or something like that. So there's a big narrative on this sort of fake, like rose-tinted idea of the past, and how like that can be really damaging and hold people back in terms of change. There was a quote from Adam Curtis, the documentary maker who was the producer, and he said that what he wanted, like what they were thinking of was like, when we live in a society that wants to have change, both left and right, why does it never happen? Why are we stuck? And I think that was one of the things they were really exploring. And I thought that it kind of does that, I think, in a way. It doesn't necessarily provide any answers, but it certainly explores the possibility. What do you think Owen's going to do? He and Anna, they go throw the sword, Excalibur-like, into the sea.
Into the sea. Very symbolic. It's left very open-ended. I don't really know. Like, probably just go back to. Do they make it all the way back to Port Talbot?
I think they're on the outskirts, looking back.
It's impressive they managed to travel our way back. But I guess what Owen's sort of saying, I'm going to take. You know, I've been given this sort of. I've been, almost handed this sort of role as I think they talk a lot about it's not actually about him, but what he symbolizes, and I think he's sort of accepted, that like he can sort of stand as a bit of a everyone sort of thinks he's the original Red Monk, but again, it doesn't really matter.
Like Katniss Everdeen in the Hunger Game books, that she's not about her; it's about what she symbolizes.
It's not about her, like what she symbolizes. He's the Katniss Everdeen of Wales.
Yeah, exactly.
It's hard to say. Probably just go back, join the protest,
like become the thing that the algorithm said he was going to.
That's so true.
Maybe it shaped him into being that. So it's like, what would you do? I don't know. I mean, I liked it insofar as I felt that he was kind of like taking ownership of his life and things like that. But of course, it was a bit of that classic kind of hero martyr narrative.
Very much so.
But I was certainly. I was thinking about this in terms of, we hear this phrase quite a lot, I want my country back, and I was thinking about it specifically with respect to Lee Anderson. And for our non-British listeners, Lee Anderson was a Conservative MP. He had previously been part of the Labour Party. He's done his journeys through the parties over the years, but he was kicked out of the Parliamentary Conservative Party after he made a Islamophobic comment regarding the London Mayor Sadiq Khan. And in fact, I think what the Conservative Party actually said was that he was wrong. He did something wrong. And they said that many, many times. But anyway, eventually he was suspended, and he has moved over to the right-wing Nationalist Party, Reform UK. And in his sort of speech regarding his defection, he made this statement, and like millions of people up and down the country, all I want is my country back. And I made me think, isn't that quite similar to this idea of like, I want things to go back to where they are? It doesn't actually mean anything at all. It's just this kind of empty idea around sort of lack of progression, some sort of idealization of the past, and quite a dangerous sort of thing to say because it is empty of meaning, but sounds like it means something. Okay, so what did we learn from watching The Way? Final.
A lot. I think it talks a lot about, you know, the intersection of the sort of past, present, future. You know, I think there's ideas of like what, you know, for the Driscoll family, you know, the legacy of Denny Driscoll and Jeff, and how that's sort of carried through by Owen, and also, you know, big themes around family and what that can mean, and, you know, it taking its different forms, and also just sort of maybe, yeah, I think we discussed a lot about what it means for like sort of security in different senses, whether that's like job security and feeling safe and protected by, you know, your own police force, and also in your job and things. It's quite a lot, but yeah, I think overall
it's a very difficult one to sum up. I think.
Very difficult one to sum up.
It's 3 episodes packed with about, you know, elements of like 10 different genres and a whole ton of different storylines all stuck together, but it's thought-provoking, I think.
Yes, for sure.
And maybe we shouldn't always look for like the conclusive message. It gives those kind of like things to think about, all of those things that you just said. So that's pretty good. Are we happy? Yeah,
very happy.
Excellent. Yeah. So what are we doing next?
Poor Things.
Good. Okay, we're going to do Poor Things just post Oscars. Good time to rewatch Emma Stone. Not like a typically dystopian film, but with strong dystopian elements and
science fiction.
Yeah, science fiction-y, sort of steampunk Victorian kind of alternative world, which again kind of plays into our ideas around world building. So yeah, great film. Thank you, Marsha, for getting me to watch it finally. So we'll be talking about that in 2 weeks' time, and in the week between this Sunday and 2 Sundays later, we will have a newsletter out to you as well. So look out for that. You can follow us on Instagram at Dystopian Fiction Current Affairs, and you can use our link tree to find out more about the podcast, what we have coming up, sign up for our newsletter, and donate to us if you feel so inclined to keep the podcast going. Thank you very much, I should say, to those people who do donate. You are extremely lovely, and also really help us cover our costs of running this. Anything else, Marsha?
Don't think so. I think that's everything.
All right. Thank you very much for listening, and we will see you again soon.